All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone. First off, I wanted to let everyone know that due to the number of participants that we have on the call, we are only allowing the presenters to be able to speak. Everybody else will be put on mute. So if you have any questions, please just type them in and we will follow up with answers in email. So as most of you know, I came from the commercial real estate industry, and the commercial real estate industry is well ahead of the residential in terms of compliance. But several years ago, they were in a similar position as we are today. And so in order to get them to comply, regulators conducted a whole bunch of audits and they imposed a lot of fines. And I believe that it's going to be our turn next. I think that now they're starting to take notice of our residential industry, especially because the dollar volumes that we're getting into now with acceleration of the housing market. So with that, we decided to put on today's session. I felt it was important that we had some guidance from true professionals. And so that is what today is going to be about. But before we go there, when Sutton did their deal with Diversified, our financial structure became a lot more complicated. And as a result of that, we've made some changes internally, and we've brought in a new CFO who is extremely well qualified. And with that, I'd like to introduce George Daines as our new CFO. George spent some time with Ernst & Young and then with Grant Thornton. But most recently, he spent the last 7 years with a company called Dundee 360. And Dundee 360 is, they are the owners of Sotheby's. And he was the one who led the acquisition of Sotheby's. So with that, I would like to pass it off to George, and he will get us started for the day. George?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Drew. Good morning, Ed, and thank you, Drew, for that introduction. I'm very excited to have joined Sutton. It's one of Canada's most recognizable brands in the real estate resale business. And I very much look forward to contributing to the growth of the company as we move forward. I hope to eventually meet or at least talk to all of you as we look to support you in your businesses as we go forward here. Today, as Drew mentioned, we have an important reminder of your responsibilities to comply with anti-money laundering regulations. While not necessarily a sexy topic, it is a crucial one. The last thing you want is to have your firm, an agent, or the Sun brand connected to a non-compliance, be it by oversight in documentation or otherwise. For the presentation, we do have Haley Howe here from M&P's Investigative and Forensic Services Group. Haley has an intimate knowledge of the subject matter and will provide you with lots of useful information today. Before we get started, just a couple of administrative items. As Drew mentioned, if you do have a question, please write it into the chat box on your screen. We will send an answer to all the questions by email to the group after the presentation. We are also recording this webinar, and we will send a link to the presentation to everybody that was invited after the presentation. And with that, with no further ado, I would like to pass it on to Haley.
Thanks, George. Thanks, Drew. I'm really happy to be here to support Sutton Group in providing this overview training and reminders of just kind of what is required from the compliance standpoint. I do find the topic kind of sexy. This is what I do every day, all day, and I've done it for way too long, probably. So I live and breathe this stuff and find it really interesting. So I hope that you will too. So just as a little reminder again, if you do have questions, I can see people are putting chats in the box. If you just type in your questions there, and then we'll collect them all up. The content is going to take us the hour, and I want to make sure that we don't get to the point where if we were doing questions at the end that people have questions and we don't have time to get to them. So this way you're going to get a reference document that you can refer to as well with the questions being answered. So with no further ado, what we will get to is the agenda. So the agenda, I've put it in place just to try and keep me honest. So we're just going to run through what is money laundering, how is it actually laundered through real estate, because I know from brokers that I've spoken to, sometimes it's not that clear. How does it affect the real estate industry in Canada? Who creates the regulations? What are the penalties? Because I know that that's important to you guys. What do you need to do to comply? I feel that a lot of the non-compliance issues are because the information perhaps isn't as clear or hasn't been put out there widespread enough for you to get the right information. So hopefully we'll cover up some of those questions. What happens when Fintrac comes knocking on your door? Available assistance and resources, and then just to wrap up to make sure that everybody has put their questions in. So starting at the beginning, this is the UN definition of money laundering. So even though there's a lot of talk about money laundering in the media, I wanted to start today's session by ensuring that we're all on the same page with regards to the concept of money laundering and how it happens. So a really simple explanation to this is a bad guy gets money from a crime. So those crimes can be anything from wildlife crimes to firearms crimes to prostitution, drug trafficking, human smuggling, so all kinds of nasty stuff. But he can't use the money because the bills are marked or can be traced, or will just look completely suspicious if he tries to use the amount of cash that he has. So he needs to put it through some kind of process to make it look like it came from a legitimate source. So in just a minute, I'll get into some more specific examples related to real estate. But before I do that, let's talk about the 3 stages of money laundering. So the first is placement. So this is when the illicit funds, the dirty money, is physically placed into the financial system. And I think that this is probably what most of us think of, the bags of cash being taken somewhere to be cleaned. And while quite often this will be a bank, a money service business, a securities firm, or a casino, all of which are reporting entities like you guys, cash can also be taken to high-end car dealerships, art dealers, and lawyers to get the money into the financial system. So criminals can use real estate as a way to get cash into the system. Although it's not as common, cash can be used for down payments, or it can be provided to real estate representatives to pass along to a lawyer to assist with the closing. But more commonly, cash may be used by the bad guy to make ongoing mortgage payments or bulk payments to financial institutions or renovation companies. So layering is when the bad guy is trying to put some distance between himself and the cash. So it's going to be multiple transactions to try and obscure ownership of funds, which could be the purchase of real estate through third parties or shell corporations. It could be wire transactions to third parties between domestic and foreign accounts. Foreign exchange transactions where you're starting with a different currency in cash, so you've cut off the trail of money. Movement between accounts, purchase of high value items. So there's a whole bunch of things that can be done. And then integration is when you're obtaining the real property which appears as clean. So if you have managed to get your money into real estate and you sell the property, now you've got a source of funds that you can take to a bank. You've got a check from a lawyer for the proceeds of the property, and that money is now clean. So it isn't necessarily the getting it in that's the problem. Sometimes it's the getting it out. So how can this be done in real life? So it's not all about the cash. So we kind of have to change our mindset a little bit about that. So it can be the use of third parties, loans and mortgages, manipulation of property values. So while we very often hear the brokers say that they don't deal in cash, so there's no reason for them to worry about money laundering, cash is without a doubt something worth keeping our eyes peeled for. So if somebody does come in with a hockey bag full of cash, probably a red flag. But in the grand scheme of things, it's a relatively small reach in the real estate sector. So let's touch on a few of these other things in the slide before we move on. So manipulation of property values, undervaluation. So a purchaser wants the purchase and sale agreement to show a lesser amount than the market value of the property. And the purchaser may make a side agreement with the seller for the different value for the actual sale price in cash. So the purchaser may offer to compensate the realtor for the commission fee or in cash or gift. So alternatively, the purchaser could place an offer on a home for well over the property value, and the purchaser obtains a mortgage for the full amount, and the seller provides the overpayment amount back to the purchaser once the deal closes. So after a few monthly payments on the mortgage, the full amount is paid off, and the person's been able to get rid of a whole bag load of cash. So if you have a client that's looking for a home to be renovated above and beyond the neighborhood, and renovations can all be paid for in cash. We know that there are lots of renovators that like cash. The property can then be sold for a much higher amount, so the clean amount of funds is going to be much bigger than the purchase price. So while you as the broker may not be involved in the renovation phase of the property at all, and we totally understand that, conversations about which renovators take cash? Do you know anybody that will take cash? Or, this is what we're trying to do to the house, and you think, oh, that's going to renovate this way above the neighborhood. That could alert you to a potential scheme that should be reported. So overseas ownership is another thing to keep an eye on, and another red flag. So this method is most commonly used by corrupt public officials, tycoons, and organized crime mafias, all things that we don't think happen in our backyard. So what's happening is these people are using nominees, third parties, to actually purchase the property in their name, not in the name of the bad guy. Or the money is run through a shell company in another country that doesn't require the presence of the buyer within its national borders to be able to make the purchase. So who actually loses? In my opinion, definitely the people who buy in the neighborhoods and end up with completely skewed idea of comparables if you've got this manipulation of the markets. And the people who are victims of the initial corruptions, which could be anything from bribery to fraud to things that are much worse. These guys are not necessarily nice people. So what can be done to protect the markets and you as real estate professionals? So Canada's Department of Finance has determined that real estate developers and brokers and representatives are covered under the Anti-Money Laundering Act and regulations. And a covered entity must comply with the regulations for the sector. So before you're grown, compliance shouldn't be equated with a business stopper. Done effectively, you can get to know your clients better and provide exceptional service. The honest public doesn't have an issue with providing the required information under the regulations. Dishonest people or those with something to hide often do. So we need to keep in mind that these are not new regulations and that Canadians are really quite well versed with what money laundering requirements are and who is covered by them. They know that when they go to a bank to open up an account, they need to show ID for anti-money laundering regulations. If they want to go to a money service business and send a wire for $1,000, they know that they need to show ID. So the requirements that have been placed on the real estate sector are really no different, and most people are very aware of those. So I think this definition covers everyone on the call today. A real estate broker or real estate sales representative means an individual or an entity that is registered or licensed in a province to sell or purchase real estate. So if that doesn't cover you, you've got on the wrong flight. You're welcome to stay, but I think it does cover everybody. So the regulations in the industry sites don't refer to real estate agents, but rather real estate sales representatives. So I've tried to be respectful with that terminology throughout the presentation. However, if I slip, please forgive me. I'm kind of old school. So in the instance where a broker or sales rep works for a firm, it's the firm's requirement to have a compliance program rather than the individual. So except for when it comes to reporting suspicious transactions, both parties have responsibility for reporting. But in terms of creating the compliance program, it would be your firm, your office that would do that. So I wanted to touch a little bit on where the rules come from, because I'm sure that Fintrac themselves couldn't think up the rules straight off the top of their head. So the Financial Action Task Force, which is the little circle at the top, also affectionately known as the FATF, is an intergovernmental body established in 1989 by the ministers of its member jurisdictions. So there's currently 35 member jurisdictions and 2 organizations which make up the membership. And this group introduces policy around money laundering and terrorist financing matters and creates the expected standards for the globe. So this is where it all starts. So while the group is a policy-making body, they're extremely influential when it comes to generating the necessary political will to implement changes or ensure that the current regime is effective. And the ramifications of not meeting the standards or not being deemed effective can be severe. So including an increased national risk assessment, which means that other countries may not want to deal with Canadian banks or offer correspondent services to our banks. Increased costs to do business globally, which could negatively impact our economy, and to an extreme, sanctions against Canadian banks and businesses. So I'm sure that you guys have read in papers, you can't do business with certain Russian banks because of what's going on between Russia and the Ukraine. You can't do business in some Caribbean countries because they don't have good money laundering practices. You can't do business in Iran with Iranian banks. So this all has to do with them not having efficient and effective anti-money laundering regulations. So in addition to the formal stakeholders, there are other forces that exert pressure on the businesses to meet requirements. You've got local government. We're hearing about local government being concerned about money laundering activities through certain sector in BC. We've got provincial regulators and associations. We've got the media. The media is a big one. We've got banks because the money ultimately flows through them. We've got consumers. So one question to think about is, as a consumer, would you want to deal with a business who has not met its corporate requirements or had very negative media coverage regarding its business and ethical practices? And do you hear about businesses that have got in trouble and wonder how they're still going? So keep these thoughts in the back of your mind, as this is the power of reputational risk, which I think can be far more costly than a fine. So as we go through and we get to the Fintrac section, keep in mind that they too are the messengers and not necessarily the enemy. So in mid-2015, the Department of Finance undertook the task of creating a national risk assessment, which looked at various types of crimes which had financial gains and would therefore need to have those funds laundered. And then they looked at the prevalence of those crimes in Canada through the various sectors who have compliance obligations to Fintrac. So this all was part of the recent FATF exam that Canada just went through. And these sectors included financial institutions, money services businesses, casinos, securities firms, accounting firms, jewelry firms, and of course, real estate. So looking at this slide, I'm sure you're wondering what wildlife crime has to do with real estate. And actually, it's not a whole bunch. But as the numbers go up in that chart, the severity of the crimes which generate dirty money goes up. So these crimes are serious, and they impact our legitimate economy. So for example, by the time we get to number 6 on that chart, we're looking at robbery and theft. Number 7 is funds obtained through the crimes of human smuggling. Number 8 is even worse, and it looks at funds resulting from smuggling and trafficking, which could include human trafficking, which, although we don't like to think about it, it's the second most profitable global crime after drug trafficking. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Mortgage fraud and securities fraud kind of rounds out the list. And number 9 is the illicit drug trafficking, organized crime, grow-ops, bribery and corruption, and third-party money laundering. So it starts off kind of, how much can you get for an iguana, to the really nasty crimes. So again, I know we don't like to think of these things happening in our backyards. We're Canadian. But it does happen to the tune of $65 billion a year in Canada, which is roughly 4% of our GDP. And that money is going somewhere. George, I just lost the presentation on the screen. Did you?
No, it's still there.
Okay. Why am I missing it? Okay, there we go. It just went to sleep, I guess. So the Department of Finance then mapped out the type of crime against the risk of the different industries. So the little black squares, they represent the real estate representatives or agents, and you'll notice that real estate representatives are viewed as riskier than accountants, which is the firm I work for, who are also covered entities, but not quite as bad as lawyers. However, this brings to light another issue. Lawyers, except notaries in BC, are not covered under the requirements due to an ongoing legal battle regarding the AML regulations and issues around solicitor-client privilege. So, you know, quite often I hear people say, well, the money goes through a lawyer, so that's okay, or the money goes through a bank, that's okay. And while the bank is a covered entity, the lawyer is not, and the information that's shared between the bank and Fintrac is not shared with you, so you may not know if they're looking at somebody as suspicious. And real estate transaction and lawyers go hand in hand, so just to kind of keep in mind that risk assessment. So as you can see, the risk of financing real estate from the sale of illegal reptiles or birds, which is the circle on the left-hand side, is quite small compared to the risk of funds derived from smuggling, trafficking, bribery, and corruption. So by now, hopefully, I've convinced you that there's a real need for real estate professionals to take notice of these risks and ensure that they're doing their part to stop money laundering. And I'm certainly not even suggesting that every real estate professional is bad, and I'm not suggesting that every real estate deal involves criminal funds. What I am saying is that the real estate sector has been identified as having a higher risk of being used to launder criminal proceeds, which requires a compliance program and obligation to help protect you as real estate professionals against being used unwittingly for criminal purposes. So that's really where we're starting. So from the FATF report, which was released in September of last year, some of the... Oh.
Haley,
Somebody
you're,
unmute their phone?
No, you seem to be
Okay,
cutting in and out.
Are we okay? Okay, we'll keep going.
You're cutting in and out.
So kind of the resounding theme. Are we okay? Okay.
That's all good.
So, okay, I'm getting quite a lot of feedback. Okay. There was a kind of a summary of the different issues, and one of the repeating issues that came up was that there was not enough supervision over the real estate sector. So some of the things are Fintrac needs to develop sector-specific expertise. This means they're going to practice on you. They're going to come out, they're going to look, they're going to do their reviews. There was concern about the number of STRs that have been received from the real estate sector, generally subject to appropriate risk-sensitive AML, CTF supervision, but supervision of the real estate and dealers in precious metals and stone sectors is not entirely commensurate to the risk of those sectors. So what that's saying is there hasn't been enough focus on the real estate sector by the regulator, and that will continue to change. So that's why this is very timely, because you want to make sure that you're ready to go when Fintrac comes knocking. So sound bites from the media, it kind of echoes what the FATF report was saying. So we've got Watchdog found significant deficiencies at nearly 500 real estate firms. Vancouver housing market vulnerable to money laundering. BC puts an end to real estate self-regulation. So these are all things that have been going on in the past 6 months, and it doesn't really show many signs of slowing down. So as a result of the attention provincial governments are taking notice, they're starting to make changes. And to self-regulation, Michael Noseworthy has now been appointed as the province's new superintendent of real estate. Imposition of the 15% foreign buyers tax in BC, and we know what that's done to the market. There's increased noise in Toronto. Although there's some pushback on imposing the tax, there is increased noise from the government there. And there's increased scrutiny by Fintrac to continue examining the real estate sector. So the Vancouver Sun recently reported that Fintrac examined 220 real estate companies in BC between 2012 and mid-2016, and they found that 112 companies had significant levels of non-compliance, and 5 had very significant non-compliance levels. So this is 53% of the reviewed entities that had at least significant issues. So over the past 10 years, since real estate has become covered under the regulations, only 127 STRs have been filed on over an estimated 5 million sales. So that's 0.0025%. So what is the reason for the non-compliance? Is it lack of awareness? Is it that it's complicated? Is it that you don't have enough help, that there's not enough resources? So that's kind of where we're going to get to. So start with the scary stuff, then we'll move to the friendly stuff. So the cost of non-compliance can be really high. I know that this slide is wordy, but this presentation is going to be made available to you, and I wanted to make sure that you had all the information, not the sound bites. So this piece is really important because this is your bread and butter. So let's break it down to make it a little bit easier. The administrative monetary penalties, or the AMPs. Let's define them as like parking tickets. So you park too long or in the wrong place, and you get a fine. So in the AML world, you didn't keep a record or you didn't file a report, and each action is described on the AMP menu as a price tag. So it has its own regulations, and every piece of the regulation is broken out and it has a price tag. So when Fintrac conducts examinations, they may apply the AMP based on the outcome of the review. So for instance, in just using simple math, they look at 100 records that you have, and where occupation is not being collected where necessary. While this is considered a minor infraction, the fine could be 100 files times $1,000 is $100,000. So if your client or if you as a broker have missed filing a suspicious transaction report, this is considered very serious and could have a price tag of $500,000 for each missed report. So chances are where that description is talking about the 5 very significant infractions, they're talking about missed reports. They're talking about not having a risk assessment. So it's something major that generally would come with a fine. Fintrac has recently been taken to court because of the way that they were applying their fines. It's only a matter of time before they've reassessed how they're applying their fines, and they're going back out to those firms. So just because today it didn't work, it doesn't mean that they're going to let it drop. So as not to be alarmist, Fintrac to date has not tried to put entities out of business, but they are trying to show the international community, the FATF, that they have the respect and attention of the reporting entities that they oversee. So in the past, fines have been reduced based on the ability to pay, the egregiousness of the offenses, and the willingness of the reporting entity, the brokerage, to mend their ways and show improvement. But what they do, and in most instances, is name and shame, and this can damage the entity's reputation, which could put them out of business and preclude them from being able to get banking services to operate their business. So I just want to draw a little bit of a parallel between the real estate sector and the money service business sector. So the money service business is, the guys that send remittance transactions or do foreign exchange, the cambios, that kind of thing. So banks view them as very high risk and make demands of them often over and above the regulations before considering providing banking services to them. So ultimately, funds flowing through the bank account reflect on the bank. And the environment is very sensitive. So the last thing that the bank wants is to hear that ABC Real Estate actually laundered proceeds for Miss XYZ, and the money has gone through the bank, because their regulator can give them grief as well. So ultimately, funds thrown through the bank account reflect on the bank, and the environment is sensitive. A Fintrac AMP can immediately result in the closing of bank accounts for these money service businesses. So with the media coverage of money laundering activity in the real estate market, and the government's interest in the housing market, the change of the regulator, and the introduction of new requirements, taxes, all kinds of stuff, real estate is top of mind. So the criminal penalties that result when Fintrac has tried to work with the So what we're saying here is that you could run into situations where you've had a nice banking relationship with CIBC, RBC, you name a bank, a credit union, and if you are found to be non-compliant with the AML regulations, that they could decide that they don't want to bank you because the risk to them is too high. And now you're stuck in a situation where you don't have a bank account. So that's where that reputational risk starts to really play on things. So going back to the slide, the criminal penalties. This results when Fintrac has tried to work with you and they're just not getting any cooperation, and there's no reason to believe that the entity is going to improve. And that's when the file basically gets passed over to the RCMP, and these are criminal fines. And you know, they're quite hefty. So we're looking at millions of dollars in fines as well as imprisonment, whereas the AMPs at least don't carry any imprisonment. So the real estate sector up to July 2016 has had 12 entities levied with $113,100 in fines. And this represents 15% of the entities fined in all sectors and about 5% of the total fines. And I've taken out the $1.5 million fine that was levied against an unnamed Canadian bank last year because that just screws the totals. So with the number of real estate examinations, the number of deficiencies, this number is expected to increase in the current months. So as a couple of examples, here we can see that we've got 36 money service businesses that have been fined. We've got one life insurance company. We've got the 12 real estate companies. So Remax Active Realty, they were a real estate broker in Mississauga, Ontario. They were fined $6,770 in 2013 for committing 4 violations. Countrywide, for basically the same violations, were fined almost double 2 years later. So the trend is not expected to change due to the length of time the real estate sector has had to build and implement the required compliance program. So in other words, Fintrac's patience is growing thinner. So this information is public information. I just took it off the Fintrac website. This is the naming and shaming, and if you get fined, your name goes up on that website for 5 long years for anybody to be able to go in and have a look. So the violations, I just wanted to summarize them. So we've got fines for the third-party determination, and we'll get into that in just a couple of minutes. Creating and maintaining required client records, ascertaining ID, so taking ID measures when needed. Incomplete or inadequate compliance regimes include failure to appoint a compliance officer, failure to develop policies and procedures, failure to have an adequate risk assessment, failure to provide training to employees, and failure to conduct the prescribed biannual review. So that's a review every 2 years of your processes. So I don't know if you're able to, as we kind of went through that list, go check, yes, we've got a compliance officer. Check, yes, we've got up-to-date policies and procedures. So again, keep that in the back of your mind. Just to kind of get the idea of the number of deficiencies that have been logged by Fintrac, we're looking at 505 deficiencies for client information recorded for a purchase and sale. So granted, this is over a long period of time, but that number is huge. We've got 207 deficiencies for ascertaining identity, 459 for a risk assessment. And this is a big piece because it's quite a new requirement under the regulations, and 418 for the review process, which means that either the review hasn't been effective or it hasn't been done at all. So again, if we look at the money service business and the real estate sector, it's very similar. Both became covered entities in 2008. Both have to have a compliance regime. Both have to report. And as you can see, it looks really, really similar, except now you don't hear that much about money service businesses, but we're hearing a lot about real estate. So let's put all the negativity aside. And start to figure out what can we do to make this better for you. So whether you're a small, medium, or large brokerage, negative press can affect you. So as such, it's everybody's role and responsibility to do the right thing and protect your brand. And as I mentioned earlier, would you do business with a company which had been fined for not following ethical business practices? And the same goes for consumers looking for real estate assistance. People are becoming much more savvy. They want to make sure that they're dealing with socially responsible companies, and they do research before they pick, you know, whether it's a bank, a real estate broker, a money service business. They do look to see, are they going to be protected or are they going to be tainted? So the compliance program, which is kind of the beginning of everything, it's the meat and potatoes of how you know that the other things that we just talked about are going to happen. So the trick of the compliance program is implementing it effectively. And you can have the best program on paper, but if nobody in your office knows about it or follows it, it's a doorstop. So the policies and procedures should at minimum document the compliance regime. So who is your compliance officer? How do you report suspicious transaction reports? How do you ascertain identity? How do you do your terrorist property searching? How do you deal with cash if it does come through your door? It will deal with record keeping, the use of personal information, business relationships, which we're going to touch on more, and the third-party determination. So there are resources to help you gather the information to create the required policies and procedures and the training and the risk assessment. These can be found on the fintrac.gc.ca site, through CREA or the Real Estate Council of BC as an example. And the documents, what I have found in looking at them, they typically outline the requirements because they are, they're very high level, and they're really just regurgitating the regulations. So they outline the requirements, but you yourself need to adopt the requirements into your business. So for example, company ABC will report any cash transactions of $10,000 or more no later than 15 days after the transaction date, rather than that Fintrac requires that a large cash transaction be reported within 15 days from the date of the transaction. So what that's saying is Fintrac told us that we have to do this in the latter example. The first example is, yes, we commit that we're going to do that. And that's what the policies and procedures should be showing. What does your office commit to do? Don't make the documents more complicated than they need to be. The CREA document is very long and really quite complicated. Assess your risks reasonably and implement actionable steps to mitigate the risk. If they can't be mitigated, consider whether the reward of the business is worth the risk of the fine or reputational damage. So as a larger-than-life example, and I know that this isn't something that will happen, but it kind of paints a picture. You state in your risk assessment that your risk tolerance overall is a low to medium. However, your business is focused on clients who want to pay cash. So based on the risk of money laundering, the inherent risk to your firm being used to launder funds would in fact be high. There are really no controls other than discontinuing that practice that would lower your risk to where you've decided that your overall risk should be. And then as a business decision, you would need to make that determination based on your determined risk tolerance. So really what that's saying is you need to have a plan. You need to make sure that you have decided how much money laundering risk you're going to take. And I would never suggest that it should be high, particularly in the sector. But then you need to have a look and say, okay, we've decided it's going to be X, but the activity that we're doing is putting us way over that. What do we need to change? And that's really what the program is all about. So just to kind of summarize things, and hopefully a picture is worth 1,000 words, very simply the compliance regime is the whys and hows you're going to meet the requirements and the rules for your business. So the record keeping is where and when you will keep the information of the clients and the business relationships and when it can be destroyed. Transaction reporting is the what. What's going to appear suspicious and could be tied to money laundering or terrorist financing activity, or what has triggered the need to file an LCTR or to keep documents on funds that have been received. So if you're a sales rep and you work for a firm, just as a reminder, it's your company, the office, it's their responsibility to create and implement a compliance regime. So under the franchise agreement, it's typically the individual franchise that's responsible for the development and management of the compliance program, not the head office. This would include having a person in charge, implementing the written policies and procedures, training, risk management plan, and having the effectiveness review conducted at least every 24 months. And then again, just as a reminder, suspicious transactions, if you see something strange, it's the responsibility of both the rep, the broker, or the office to make that report. Doesn't need to be 3, just as long as it gets in there once. So there are things that you need to do every day. There are things that are there as a safeguard, and there's a second level to kind of do that check and balance. So the things to do every day, you're identifying your clients as they're buying and selling homes, as you're taking funds from them from purchases. You're keeping transactional records. You're reporting suspicious transactions. Maybe you guys are one of the 127. You're reporting cash transactions. You're looking to make sure that the clients that you're dealing with are not on terrorist lists. And you're managing that money laundering risk every day. So towards the fulfillment of those responsibilities, you've got a person in charge. You've got policies and procedures that you're making sure are being followed. You've got training for your employees or your agents, and you've got risk management plans. And then that overall check to say, are you effective, is the AML audit, which happens every 2 years, and the Fintrac examinations, which happen whenever they feel like. So when do you need to identify a client? There are certain triggers that occur that will require you to ascertain the identity of your client. So namely the purchase or sale of real estate, receipt of funds, or when you're filing a suspicious transaction report. So when we talk about the receipt of funds, I'm also including in there large cash transactions, although I know that that doesn't happen very often. So if you're filing a suspicious transaction and you can get identity documents without tipping off your client, then there is an expectation that you're doing that. That if you feel that asking for the ID before you file the STR may tip them off, then obviously you've got to weigh those situations. So ascertaining your client's identity means obtaining proof of who they say they are. This can be done through seeing in person a government-issued ID, such as a driver's license, a passport, or other similar piece of ID. If the client is not in front of you, you haven't managed to meet them face-to-face, then there are procedures on how to identifying them. But getting a copy of a driver's license or a passport faxed to you does not meet the requirements. And I know that I've looked at some real estate firms, and this has been quite common practice. It doesn't meet the requirements, and basically it means that you haven't ascertained the identity of your customer and you've already got a strike. So when you do 2 things that require identification to be ascertained, you then enter into what has been defined as a business relationship, which has additional obligations for risk assessment and ongoing monitoring. So based upon the guidance that Fintrac has put out, it's very clear that if a client is buying and selling a home, that's 2 transactions, you've got a business relationship. But if the client makes a purchase and writes you a check for a down payment, that's 2 instances where you've had to ascertain ID. So even though you're not necessarily getting the client to whip out their driver's license for a second time because you've recorded on the purchase and sale agreement, you've now entered into a business relationship with that person. And I think that that's somewhere where there's deficiencies. So what records must be kept? So we've talked about large transaction records, which is every amount of cash, $10,000 or more, that you receive from a client in a single transaction in a 24-hour period. So that could be a client comes in at 10 in the morning and gives you $5,000 and comes back at 2 in the afternoon and gives you $5,000. That is defined as a single transaction. When you take that amount of cash, then you have to do that third-party determination, which is where you take reasonable measures to determine whether the individual is acting on behalf of a third party. The receipt of funds record is required when you receive any amount, whether or not it's in cash. So if somebody is writing you a check for $5,000 for a down payment when you put in your offer, or once the offer is accepted, they give you the check, that needs to have a record kept, and you're ascertaining the ID of the person. Client information records. A real estate broker or representative, you have to keep a client information record for every purchase or sale that you do, and that would include the client's name and address, the nature of the client's principal business or occupation. If the client's an individual, the client's identification details. If it's a business that you're doing the sale or purchase for, you would have to ascertain the existence of the company, and we can talk about that separately. So generally, records are kept for a minimum of 5 years from the date the report is created, such as in the case of an LCTR or an STR, or 5 years from the date the transaction is completed or the business relationship is ended. So this would be the case for the purpose and intended nature of the business relationship records. So getting into suspicious transaction reports, because this is where Fintrac really looks at the effectiveness of the program. And from the squawking that's going on, we know that they feel that there should be more suspicious transactions being filed than are being filed. So I know that it's difficult to think of a client or someone you know as suspicious, but sometimes when you look at what you do actually know about the person, you realize that you don't know that much. So for instance, you may know that the person's name is Bob Smith, and he says he's a student. He's told you that he's recently come to Canada to study, and when you come to close your real estate purchase, Bob gives you a bank draft drawn on a foreign bank for the full amount of the purchase. And you wonder, or you should wonder, where did a student get that amount of money, and why would a foreign student want to purchase a home in Canada when they're on a student visa? So in instances like this, ask some additional questions. And asking questions shouldn't be equated with interrogation. It can be, general questions over a coffee to try and get more information. Be interested. So, some additional questions may be, is the home mortgaged in your home country? Can I please verify the mortgage documents? What are your plans once you finish your studies? Do you have job opportunities here? And you may wish to ask what the studies are in. Are you also working in Canada? And will the student visa allow the student to work? And is the correct occupation listed? So if they are working, should that be put down rather than student as their occupation? How are the mortgage payments going to be made to service the debt in that home country? And if you can't get the answers to these simple questions, or it appears that the person that you're dealing with is maybe a front person, so every time you ask a question, they say, oh, I'll get back to you on that, and then they come back to you with an answer, you should try to determine if there is a third party controlling the transaction, and this is just the person's name that it's going into. If there is, additional information is required, and if the client says no, but you still suspect, this should be reported and your suspicions noted. So under the regulations, even though you have to file a suspicious transaction, it doesn't mean that you cannot complete the transaction. Now, if the same person were to come back the next day and want to do another purchase on another property, you may consider saying no. But for the initial transaction, if you have your doubts, document them and file the report. It doesn't mean that you have to turn away the business. In the same way that a bank does not have to close an account, or a money service business have to turn away business. What Fintrac is really looking for is the information to be passed along to them, because it's one piece of a puzzle that may be the piece that shows that that person is either funneling money from a foreign country, is part of an organized crime gang. Information, even though you may view it as quite small, is very important. Fintrac expects that both attempted or completed transactions are filed. So you may have, so let's clarify the attempted transaction definition. So if a potential buyer calls your office and wants to be shown some houses that they may be interested in purchasing, but then doesn't put in an offer, this would not be considered suspicious, as there's no transaction, no purchase or sales agreement, nothing going on. If a potential buyer puts in an offer for a property and it's countered by by the seller, and the purchaser doesn't want to enter into the bidding war, this, in my opinion, is not suspicious. It's rather wise, particularly in the BC market. But a client who's shown interest in moving forward with an offer and then doesn't want to provide information for your client information file and declines to move forward should be reviewed for red flags to determine if it should be filed as an attempted suspicious transaction. Similarly, a client who's declined a transaction with you when you ask them to show ID, but has now moved forward with another rep in your office, should be reviewed to ensure that all the details are collected and verified correctly. For instance, when dealing with the second agent, the client decided that they were going to use a corporation or trust to purchase the document that would obscure the actual ownership of the purchase. This, in my opinion, would be a potential completed STR. And it may be beneficial to implement a process which has unusual transactions referred to your compliance officer for review, and then determine whether or not your report should be filed. This assists with the record keeping, consistent review and risk assessment, and oversight within your office. And this should include deals which have been canceled to determine the reasons and whether an attempted STR should be filed. So I put here a bunch of red flags to consider, and there may be some scenarios when you read through that list of red flags that may seem familiar. And while some of the scenarios may seem commonplace, and I would say the presence of one red flag does not a money launderer make. If you've got multiple flags that make you kind of scratch your head, that's where some additional investigation should be considered. So we've got client purchases property in someone else's name, such as an associate or relative. Client pays the initial deposit with a check from a third party that isn't a spouse or a parent. Client wants to build a luxury house in a non-prime location. So many of those things that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So again, this presentation is going to be made available to you. So all of these red flags will be there for your review. I'm just trying to keep up with the time. So again, just some more things which may be commonplace. And if we're walking through these ones and the red flags, you're thinking, oh, that sounds like Mr. Smith or Ms. Jones, I encourage you to go back and look at the transaction. Even though it may have occurred in the past, the timeline for reporting STRs is 30 days from the date that the transaction is deemed suspicious. So a transaction that happened 6 months ago that you're now beginning to think sounds weird, and you go back and investigate and look at it and decide to file an STR, it isn't late, as long as you file it within 30 days of when you thought that that was suspicious. So if a client sells a property below market value with an additional under-the-table payment, STR, client purchases property without inspecting it, maybe not an STR right off the bat, but I mean, if you think about it, would you do that? And that's really the reasonability test is, we're all smart people. Would you do these things? Do you have $10,000 in cash lying around? Could you purchase 3 or 4 houses at a time? And your occupation is that you're a consultant at MNP? The answer is no. So, you kind of have to look at the reasonability of the transaction that the person is doing. So just to start keeping STRs in mind. So the business relationships we touched on, you enter into a business relationship when you conduct 2 or more transactions in which you have to ascertain the identity of the individual or confirm the existence of a corporation or other entity. So this is important, again, going back to the situation where you've got a purchase and somebody gives you a down payment, cash or check. You've got 2 instances where you have ascertained identity, you've entered into a business relationship, and now you have to look at the risk of that relationship to your office. It's not just a transaction, you now have a relationship, you're now dating. So once you enter into that business relationship, you need to have the purpose of and the intended nature of the relationship. So is it a family purchase? Is it a corporate purchase? Is it a flip because they buy houses regularly and renovate them and sell them again? So all of those things should be documented. Terrorist property. We don't like to think that we deal with terrorists, and 9 times out of 10, in fact 99 times out of 100, we're not going to be dealing with terrorists. But we still have to do our checks. So there's 2 situations that can trigger the requirement to send a terrorist property report to Fintrac: knowing that the property is owned or controlled on behalf of a terrorist, or believing that the property is owned or controlled on behalf of a terrorist. So all of the names that we have to worry about are all rolled into what's called the OSFI list, and I have included in the presentation the links to where you can find these names. And when you do a transaction, a purchase or a sale, we should be looking at the names to make sure that that person does not appear on it. So I also wanted to touch on when a stranger calls. So Fintrac's powers and what to expect when they give you the dingle that they're coming to visit you. And the call will come. We know that there's increased focus on the real estate sector, and they will get through all the 20,000 real estate brokerages over a period of time. It's just a matter of time. So when Fintrac gives you a call, they can come back, they can say, we are going to come visit you in 2 months. You have a month to provide us with your information. And then once they've been to visit you, they can come back in 6 months, they can come back in 3 years, depending on what it is that they found. So they're not going to be saying to you, we're going to come in 3 months, update all your stuff, and then send it to us, and we'll be there and have a look at it. When they make that call, the compliance updates stop, and they are looking at what is in place on the day that they called. So there's 3 types of Fintrac exams. There's the compliance assessment report, which is a questionnaire to gauge high-level understanding of the organization's compliance program. This would have been more common maybe back in 2010, 2011, when it was quite new for the real estate sector to be covered under the regulations. Now we're moving into the desk exam. So this will be, hello, Mr. Broker. I need your compliance policies and procedures, your risk-based approach. Keep your records. We'll look at those when we come on site. Let me see your training, and you would supply it all to them. They assess everything, and they come and look at your records on site. Alternatively, they can do a full on-site exam when they give you a call and say on such and such a date we're going to be there and we're going to look at everything. Typically what we see is the desk exam. So the process can take a considerable amount of time to go from the notice of the examination to the worst case scenario, which is a fine and your appeal process. So it could take sometimes upwards of a year. So, you know, this is just kind of a little bit of the steps. So our advice is prepare for before the notification call, and the preparation starts prior to the notification call from Fintrac. So as I just said, once the phone call comes, you can't really scramble to make changes and create documents, because what Fintrac is looking for is the effectiveness of the program. So again, to have a beautiful document that nobody knows about, or it hasn't been implemented for the period of time going back that they're looking for, is actually going to look worse for you, because now you haven't implemented the program. So it's all about being prepared now. So MNP can assist in a number of ways, and I know that I've covered a lot of information, and everybody's going to be at different places in the compliance life cycle. And you know, some of you may have used existing resources to pull together the components and are wondering if it's enough, and we can help you with a gap analysis of the program to the requirements. At times, reporting entities like to take this approach before a full review is done, so the biannual review, so that enhancements are easier to manage before a review that they may have to share with their banks or regulators. For entities a little further along the life cycle, you may be ready for that biannual review. but you don't have an internal audit department with AML experience or a group that's independent of your compliance person to assess your program. And we're able to provide this independent service to meet the regulatory requirements around the effectiveness review. Training is core to the program. We can help tailor training to meet your needs. And when the call does come from Fintrac, we can help you prepare for the examination. I work with clients to kind of sit through their exams because they get nervous. You know, it can be very intimidating to have these government people there. And sometimes they just need that little prompt to say, hey, why don't you show them this thing in your policies and procedures about what you do in this situation? They're like, oh yeah. And it helps to drive the conversation in a positive light. So once finding letters have been issued by Fintrac, there may be work to do, and certainly I can assist with reviewing procedures, helping to remediate issues. It may be that Fintrac has found that you haven't collected occupation in the documents that they've looked at, and they suggest that you need to go back and get that information. And you don't have the resources to do that, so certainly that's something that an outside source can help you do. So the next step for you, so the takeaways, I want to make sure that this hour is productive, is consider where you are regarding the development and implementation of your compliance regime. Have you conducted your effectiveness review? So basically, if your office has been in business for 8 years, you should be going on to your 4th review. And that is a big pillar of the compliance regime. You could have your policies and procedures, you could have your risk assessment, you could have your training, but your compliance regime is going to fall short if you can't show that effectiveness review. And it's a big deal on the AMP menu. Are you ready to be examined if Fintrac calls you today? Or are you going to go into panic mode? Do you need assistance to meet your compliance obligations? Are you confused? And, you know, I haven't been able to unconfuse you because this is, you know, obviously a high level type of presentation. But are there things that you're thinking, I just don't get it, and I'm not able to explain it? We're there to help. So in terms of resources, Sutton Group has provided this overview session and will shortly make available to all the participants a copy of the presentation, a recording of the webinar. In the next week to 10 days, any questions that have been submitted will be answered and distributed through an email. And included will be a short survey which you'll be able to get feedback on the presentation, as well as identify any areas which you would like assistance. And again, I'm happy to reach out and provide you any assistance that I can. So I'm Haley Howe. This is my contact information. Please feel free to email me or give me a phone call. I'm very, very happy to talk to anybody. As you can tell, I like to talk. And we can try and make this easier and not quite so confusing for you. So with that, I say thank you, and I hand it back over to George to wrap up.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. I see there's a few questions that are being typed in, so we will answer all the questions and send you an email with all the answers. There are some suggestions that we think would be very pertinent, and we will respond to all of them in short order. So expect an email from us soon, and thank you, everyone, for joining. And all the best. We'll be in touch soon. Thank you.
George, are you able to copy that chat and email it to me, and then I can work through those questions?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I'll send you an email with all the questions. Yeah.
Perfect. Very good.